I'm George Galloway.
And I'm Adam Gary.
And together we are the History Boys. Welcome to a very special edition of the History Boys to commemorate, to celebrate Victory Day. On the 9th of May 1945, Hitler fascism was crushed and defeated amidst the rubble of Berlin. The Führer, the man who had boasted that he had founded a 1,000-year Reich of German fascism, would lie mouldering in his grave. He was utterly defeated. The Nazi war machine, which had seemed for so many years literally unbeatable, had been beaten. And when the red flag was hoisted on the Reichstag on the 1st of May, well, that was as iconic a moment in history as any that there has ever been. Victory Day was something that belonged to many people, to many tens, hundreds of millions of people. It belonged, yes, to Britain, which had stood alone against Hitler when his forces were at the Channel ports, and when, if Churchill had surrendered, succumbed, Britain too would have been under Nazi occupation. Indeed, all of Western Europe might well have therefore stayed under the jackboot of fascism. This is important stuff. Don't regard it as ancient history, because just think counterintuitively, or counterfactually rather. If Hitler had marched up the Mall with the magnates of the City of London rushing out to sell him financial services, and the fifth column inside Buckingham Palace opening the gates for him, if that had happened, I'd be speaking to you in German, except I wouldn't be speaking at all, because no freedom might well exist anywhere. It's a victory that belonged to the United States of America, whose sacrifice in the Second World War, which they of course entered belatedly, but when they did, they gave their blood on the beaches of Normandy and in the South Pacific, and also later after D-Day in the drive to the Oder of the British and American forces. But it's a victory that owes everything. The overwhelming credit for the victory over Hitler fascism must go to the peoples of the Soviet Union, to the Red Army, which sacrificed millions of its men and women. The casualties of the peoples of the Soviet Union dwarfed all other nations' casualties. And Mr. Churchill himself graciously and repeatedly gave that credit. The Red Army, he said, tore the guts out of the Wehrmacht. They deserve the greatest credit for the defeat of Hitlerism, the victory on the 9th of May, which we celebrate. Adam Gary is the cleverest man in England, so I'm going to let him speak. Now, Adam, it's my view that the Wartime Alliance of the USA, Great Britain, and the USSR was the high point of human civilization. Am I overselling that?
Certainly not in the modern sense, not at all. Francis Fukuyama, an infamous historian who said that around 1991 history had ended, well, he was certainly wrong, because history never ends, and unfortunately we repeat a lot of the same mistakes. But if history had ended, hypothetically, on the 9th of May 1945, I for one think the world would have been a much better place by the turn of the 21st century than what it actually actually became when the forces of unity and alliance gradually gave way first to Cold War and then to a hegemonic unilateralist approach that only now, almost 20 years into the 21st century, is dying down because of the rise of Russia's friendly neighbor, China.
Now, it needn't have ended in the way that it did. There were plenty of people in Churchill's cabinet, in Buckingham Palace, that wanted Britain to surrender to Hitler, a surrender peace by which Britain would have, quote unquote, kept its empire, and Germany would have been hegemonic throughout Europe, including in Britain. It was Churchill and one or two others in the upper reaches of British politics that refused to countenance surrender.
Absolutely, and that surrender wouldn't have been as win-win, perverse though it is to say that in this situation, as one might have imagined. And to understand that, one needs to understand the ignominious beginnings of the war. Now, all wars have ignominious beginning. The very definition of war would actually prohibit something beginning in a glorious way, even though the fiends that led the great powers into the First World War certainly said otherwise. But by 1919, the world knew better, or at least so we were led to believe. We hear a lot in the 21st century about these wars for oil. Well, the Second World War was the first war in the world for oil, because the entire root of the German invasion of the Soviet Union was because while the Germans had technical expertise, while they had industrial sophistication, while they had a very stratified corporate sector that was fused with the government, that was indeed how Mussolini himself, the founder of modern fascism, defined the term. Germany didn't, and indeed today still doesn't, have natural resources. What did the Soviet Union have? Well, it had oil, gas, it had rubber, it had timber, it had chrome, it had multiple precious metals, it had grain. All of these things were severely lacking. And if it wasn't bad enough that Germany needed it in a comparative peacetime environment in the mid-1930s, by the time that Hitler was getting ready to put the country on an economy that was preparing for total war, things really did hit the fan quite rapidly.
And Barbarossa, the barbarous invasion of the Soviet Union, a sneak attack.
Yes.
It started, of course, very successfully. What happened?
Well, between 1939 and June the 22nd of 1941, the Soviets and the Germans were in a relationship of convenience in which they publicly declared a non-aggression pact, and privately they agreed to divide the territories of Central and Northeastern, and indeed a bit in Southeastern Europe, according to this agreement between Molotov, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, and Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister. Now, contrary to a lot of rumor and innuendo, at the same time that the Soviets were negotiating with the Germans, they were also negotiating a tripartite pact with the British Empire and with the Republic of France. The difference was that the British and French didn't really know what to do with that pact. It could have prevented the war from ever happening. It could have prevented the killings in Central and Eastern and Southern and frankly most of continental Europe from happening. But the deal fell through, and the Soviets, being unprepared for an ideological clash, as frankly most people are, they succumbed to the basic material needs and material resolutions of the time, something that a centrist or a Marxist who understands history through material terms would both agree is a logical conclusion, an inevitable one of the kinds of negotiations that happened. But Hitler was always in two minds about the pact. Hitler, from his earliest days and his earliest writings in Mein Kampf, was essentially slandering all Slavic peoples, and Russia's in particular, as the Untermenschen, the subhumans, in the same category as the Romantic peoples, as the Jewish peoples, as the Roma peoples. And so the Russians, according to Hitler's ideology, which he used for a time to unite the country, they weren't going to fare well. And so between August of 1939 and June of 1941, you had this peculiar and even surreal environment where both sides hid their ideologies, or at least a portion of their ideologies, because of economic needs. And so, in that sense, it was really all down to Hitler betraying the pragmatic deal and doing something that turned out to be ludicrous. Many in Germany thought at the time it was going to be ludicrous, but ultimately, Hitler didn't want to do deals for products, for trade. Hitler, in many ways, was the world's first great modern protectionist. The autarkic economy of Germany was all based on debt. It happened to be internal debt financed by something called MIFO bills. But essentially, like with all countries that run themselves on debt, hello Federal Reserve, not saying America has a Nazi ideology, but debt is dangerous, and it leads people to say, right, since we can no longer afford to trade in a normal way because we've cut ourselves off through autarky and we've bankrupted ourselves through debt, the only thing left is to use military might to seize the assets of a foreign country.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with Operation Barbarossa.
Let me take you back, though, just a minute. Stalin, and I've read all the material on the period, and Ivan Maysky's diaries, the British Soviet ambassador to Britain throughout the 30s and most of the Second World War. The Soviet Union was beseeching Britain and France to make an anti-Nazi pact. What you said, that the British and the French didn't know what to do with it. Let me put a finer point on that. They didn't want a pact with Stalin because they couldn't make up their mind who they hated most, Hitler or the Soviet Union.
And indeed, from their perspective, it was the folly of the First World War all over again. Britain should have realized, along with France, that if the Soviet Union bookends one section of Europe all the way to the Pacific, and if Britain bookends the other side on the Atlantic, the logical thing to do would to be contain German aggression and eventually reach some sort of pragmatic understanding that way. That could have ended this Hitlerite expansionism that we saw. But instead they dragged their feet, much like they essentially sleepwalked into the First World War, which I would argue was even more ignominious in its end than in its beginning, quite unlike this war. And because of that, Russia was left with no other choice but to say, look, our industry is growing, our technological advancement is growing, but we can't compete with the Germans. No one at the time, in terms of technology for technology, could, with the exception of British air defences. To Britain's supreme credit, radar and sonar were more advanced in Britain than in anywhere else in the world. But apart from air power and specifically air defences, Germany was the only gig in town in terms of incredibly sophisticated military machinery, the likes of which the world had never seen up to that point. And so Stalin said, look, we have a surplus of oil, of timber, of rubber, of copper, of chrome. We're going to do what we need to do. Even though, to be fair, while Hitler always had in the back of his mind that Operation Barbarossa or something similar would come one day sooner rather than later, Stalin was in fact blindsided in June of 41.
Yes, and thus the German army's advance into Russia was extraordinary, like a knife through butter. That's not entirely fair because partisans formed behind enemy lines as the Germans passed and continued resistance and so on. But the first period of the advance, the summer period of the advance, was enormous. The Soviets suffered millions of casualties, lost millions of prisoners, and remarkably soon, the Nazis were at the gates, literally, of Moscow.
Absolutely. And I think within this war, and I think one of the reasons that to this day, the 9th of May remains a holiday throughout Russia and much of the former Soviet spaces and even beyond in Serbia, the heartland of the former Yugoslavia, is because the sacrifices that were made is that which is unfathomable to most people, even in countries where tremendous sacrifices were made. At the time, during the period of the Soviet Union after 45, the official figure for Soviet deaths was 20 million. In the 90s, that was revised to 26 million, but some Russian historians think that the total number, when one includes those who had still died and not been accounted for, the so-called missing in action, those who were spilt into mass graves, when you combine all of these horrifying statistics, it's closer to 40 million. This human sacrifice was such that there is no one, literally no one, in Russia today who didn't have at least one ancestor who died during that war. It literally was a war for survival. And that's why leaders come and go, ideologies go in and out of fashion, systems of government do the same. But for the Russian people and the allies in the former Soviet Union today, this war is about the struggle to preserve life and limb, the struggle to preserve nation, to preserve culture, to preserve families. And this sacrifice, God willing, it will never be repeated again because it won't ever need to be. But as the world stands right now, it is the biggest single sacrifice ever made by one peoples for their own survival and the survival of millions of others in history.
The sieges of Moscow, of Leningrad, and of course, most famously, of Stalingrad, were truly epic in their proportions, almost unimaginably epic. People eating dogs and horses, people starving to death, freezing to death through starvation, the Nazi war machine ready to break down the gates of all three. And yet the tables were turned. The besieged peoples broke free and turned those tables. To what would you ascribe that astonishing turnaround? Partly the weather, isn't it? I mentioned the summer invasion of the Soviet Union. Many people, including Napoleon, as George Bush would put it, underestimated the Russian winters.
Absolutely. There were three main elements where after Stalingrad in particular, the tide of the war was turned and turned permanently. First of all, there was the Russian weather, then there was the Russian spirit, and third, there were the Russian generals. There was an expression that was unspoken but very pervasive during and after the war, where if a Russian soldier were to retreat towards his own officers, the chances of death were guaranteed. If he were to charge towards the Germans, it's a bit more like 50-50. And so it was such a tough war that the spirit was one of fighting for survival. And everyone, to a man, to a child, to a woman, because women, of course,
many women fighters in the Red Army.
There was a true spirit of national unity and a fight for survival, the likes of which one can only really derive when one talks to one of the survivors who sadly are getting more and more advanced in their age. But when you speak to one of them, you can feel something which just gives one a hint of that spirit. And among some who might have either been cowardly or afraid or bamboozled by the storm and fury of war, if they did retreat, there would have been no going anywhere. There was no retreat. And so the combination of the toughness of the Russian people, the stubbornness of the Russian officers not to allow cowardice, and the monolith that is the Russian expanse. I mean, there's a famous conversation that that apocryphally took place. Most historians, though, do think that it's real, between Hitler and the leader of Finland after Stalingrad. And in one of his rare moments of humility, an emotion not tended to be associated with Hitler, he said, "I underestimated the vastness of this country, the sophistication of this country, and the toughness of this country." Because the method that the Germans had used relied on speed. It was called blitzkrieg, lightning war. The same engines that power the modern German cars of today, the forbearing technology of that was used in the tanks and the armored vehicles and even the armed motorbikes that rushed into these countries and were just able to subdue them and crush them instantly. That might have worked in Poland, that might have worked in much of Central and Eastern Europe, but a country as expansive as Russia, no matter how fast you go, the tortoise is going to outrace the hare.
Now, you're a centrist, you're not like me, someone nostalgic for the Soviet Union, but you must see, as you wonderfully described it there, the responsibility for that discipline, that organization, that sophistication, and that national unity lies with the Soviet government and state. I mean, these things don't happen by accident. The peoples of the Soviet Union were not a tray of sand blowing in the wind. If they had been, the Blitzkrieg would have scattered them. But they stayed together and fought and won. You must surely give some credit, even Churchill did, to the Soviet Union and its leader.
There's no question at an objective level that the fact that the state was so highly centralized allowed for such a unified mobilization. To be fair, there were prominent traitors. Vlasov, an old white general from the 1920s and teens, actually welcomed Hitler, but he was in a minority. The vast and overwhelming majority of people were united, not all because they bought into the cult of Stalin, not all because their lives had improved between the 1920s and the 1930s, but at that moment, everything allied. The centralization of the party political controlled state, a Stalinist figure who was always larger than life, but he transformed himself to a man who frightened some of his own into a man who frightened the enemy. And that spirit was actually imbued within the Russian people, that we're going to defend ourselves and our land in the same way that Stalin, how shall we put it, defended his personal interests during the infamous events of the 1930s. And so absolutely, the centralization that the party state created played a big role in mobilizing that massive defense. But I think overall, the credit is owed to the people more than to any ideology. And there's not, in today's modern Russian thinking, there's not really a schism between that. Stalin is actually more popular than ever because political scandals, purges, and other such accoutrements will eventually fade from memory. But war heroism doesn't, which is why, for example, as we discussed in a previous episode, Churchill, for all his faults and virtues, has to be thought of as an overall virtuous character, because when many in Britain wanted to sabotage the fight, wanted to surrender, and they would have lost their British Empire just as the Soviets would have lost if they didn't go to the front after June 1941. It was these figures who stand in the collective memory of certainly almost everyone in Russia, and most people, I would say, in Britain, certainly those with a circumspection that goes back beyond the last 20 years. They see Stalin and they see Churchill as men of their times, men who shaped their times, but men who saved their countries from annihilation. And if you don't have a country to save, arguments about this political view or another become totally irrelevant.
Now, Victory Day will be celebrated massively in Russia,
Yes.
To a lesser extent, but still big in the former Soviet space. But it's increasingly coming under attack by the forces of revanchist nationalism. Actual literal fascists are on the march in the Baltic states, above all in the Ukraine,
Yes.
Desecrating the Great Patriotic War's memorials, resurrecting the reputations, rehabilitating actual collaborators who murdered their own citizens, who set upon their own Jewish population before the SS even got there. How do you account for that?
Well, I have to say the Soviet Union was right in warning throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s that if we don't have a Soviet system and a series of friendly allies in the Warsaw Pact within Central and Eastern Europe, the floodgates of fascism, the werewolves as they were portrayed in Soviet cartoon iconography, they would return. And in the 90s, when liberalism was very much in vogue, it was very fashionable to say those Soviets were only defending their own interests. They knew that fascism is dead, and whether you have communism or liberalism or any other ism, it's not going to come back. Well, the Soviets were right and the liberals were wrong, because fascism in much of Eastern Europe is back. And I'm not talking this hyperbolic fascism that anyone in a country like Britain or the United States is tarred with that name if they happen to be somewhat to the right of, I don't know, that great leftist Gordon Brown or Tony Blair. I'm talking about the real thing, people marching in fascist SS uniforms, singing the songs of the fascist brigades of that period, and beyond just vandalizing memorials to the dead, which is a desecration of a grave, something which in virtually every culture in the world is considered sinister, they're actually setting themselves upon old, frail men in their 80s and 90s, standing there with shaking hand, carrying that flag that they marched into battle, and these young fascist thugs, some of them in their teens, beating these old men. One has to say objectively, no matter what the politics, the Soviet Union warned throughout the 20th century that this would happen, and sadly it is happening right now.
So, Victory Day ought to be a day of celebration throughout the United States, throughout Britain, throughout the world, which would otherwise have been under that jackboot of Hitlerism. But it isn't, is it? I mean, I have a poster somewhere, Churchill, let us go forward together. The spirit of national unity and international unity in that great alliance has been lost. We now are encouraged to regard Russia as our enemy, not as our great ally. The relationship between the United States and Russia, despite Donald Trump's promises, has been reset back to certainly pre-Ronald Reagan.
Yes.
And there will be precious little celebrating of Victory Day outside of Russia and the former Soviet space. Why is that?
It's very sad because on the 9th of May there's a new tradition where after the Great Parade, men, women and children march in what's called the Immortal Regiment, carrying photos of the fallen from the war. It's tear-jerking, this event, and it has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with people. It has to do with culture. It has to do with the most supreme sacrifice in modern human history. And yet in America, where the military cemeteries are lined with heroes who fought in that war. In Britain, where the same is true. In France, it passes by as just another day, with the exception of some small gatherings, usually by Soviet war memorials. And it's very sad because today, while Britain and Russia have a different system of government, and while the same is true with the United States, whatever happened to win-win cooperation? I mean, the term win-win, as we know it now in diplomatic language, mostly derived from China, the term didn't exist in May of 1945, but the concept has always been universal. Churchill put it the best way: to George war is better than to war. After countries shared this experience, even when inevitable minor or even mid-sized disputes would come up over the years, why go back to this mentality of war, of hostility, of caution rather than transparency? And that's why, as someone who knows the history of the 30s and 40s and who has spoken to the heroes on all of the different sides who fought collectively in that struggle, it beggars belief that these little men occupying small offices actually think that there's a real dispute between the Western powers and Russia in a real struggle, that somehow minor differences about this or that diplomatic policy or oil routes or the other nonsense is an actual dispute. You'd have to be a child to believe that, and unfortunately many leaders of the West today are grown men with childish minds.
And don't forget that if it had not been for the British people standing alone against Hitler when he was at the Channel ports, the Victory Day that we'll be celebrating on the 9th of May might never have been possible. I've been George Galloway.
I've been Adam Gary.
Together, we are the History Boys.